Professor Dubey, Professor Manti, Professor Nityanand, you've been so kind in asking me to give this lecture that out of gratitude for your invitation, I will not try to thank you. And out of humility, I shall not try to say how privileged I feel in being invited. Since I'm not a scholar, or if I'm one, not of a great distinction, I do not promise this distinguished audience any cutting-edge research in my paper. I written this paper with a bleeding heart, but I shall try to read it in as cold a tone as I possibly can muster the courage and conviction to make. It is now 150 years since the Criminal Trials Act, the CTA, came into existence. And we all know about it. But Sher Ali Afridi, the name makes no sense to us in 2021. I cannot say that Afridi is an entirely forgotten name. Probably the Afridi name was forgotten soon after it was uttered in Andaman 150 years back. Ali Afridi was from the area of the erstwhile Punjab province, which now is in Pakistan, a Pakhtun and a former Sepai in the Khyber Agency. He lived a short life during the high colonial times. He was arrested and transported to Andaman for serving his jail term. This was almost a quarter century before construction of the cellular jail had commenced in 1896, and a few years after the first batch of some 800 expelled persons was packed off to what is now the Port Blair. Afridi, a lover of freedom, had his fleeting moment of glory when he succeeded in killing Lord Mayo, popularly known as Mayo in India. Born in 1822, educated at the Trinity, Dublin, Richard Southwell Burke, which was his name, the 6th Earl of Mayo, was posted to India in January 1869 as Viceroy. He is remembered for his work of improving the relations between the Afghans and the British. In India, he is generally remembered for carrying out the first ever caste-based census. In February 1872, as the Viceroy was on a visit to Andaman, he was stabbed to death by Sher Ali. What was the reason? Barely 15 weeks before the murder had Mayo given green signal to the first Criminal Tribes Act of India that turned a large number of innocent persons into criminals. The work of the CTA 1871 had started several decades ago. William Sleeman, 1788 to 1856, was appointed specifically to crush organized gangs during the 1830s and 1840s. He did his industrious work by listing every group of armed persons and every armed clash, listed them by their caste and community names. And in the process, he floated an immensely popular idea, but erroneous idea, that there were hordes of thugs freely roaming in central India. The Victorian imagination in England was ready to lap up the thuggy story. Indians, in contrast, were completely unaware of Sleeman's action and his potential for a long-term consequence. The most dramatic consequence was formulation of the CAT, the Criminal Tribes Act, 2 decades later. The less dramatic but far more destructive consequence was that the people in India accepted the idea that some sections of the society are naturally criminal. One does not know if Ali Afridi had foreseen the forthcoming demonization of the communities branded as criminals by the CTA. Whether he did or did not, the tag of criminality has continued to stick to a large number of Indians and for far too long. One might tend to think that the communities that were brought under the purview of the CTA, the 1871 and all its subsequent revisions, were in a way like all other classes, communities, and groups victimized by the colonial rule. That they certainly were, but their real tragedy began after the colonial rule ended and India gained independence. During the British times, we were restricted from making frequent movements, going out of the specific area within which they were restricted, or were confined to reformatory settlements, deprived of their traditional livelihood and land ownership of any kind. However, when India gained independence, prepared and adopted the constitution, and started preparing for its first general elections, the cities, the criminal tribes, were still inside their confinement areas and settlements. It was not until August 1952 that they were declared free. But this freedom came with a catch. The reformatory settlements were thrown open after several generations had vested themselves inside, carrying out the unpaid compulsory labor for the colonial civil construction projects, but they had nowhere to go. The life of any individual without land or livelihood is difficult enough. But if, in addition, the person has to carry a social stigma, it becomes far more unbearable. The cities denotified, beginning with 1952, had to face such wretched life. They became the non-persons, drowned in the dung heap of scorn, contempt, atrocity, and utter poverty. They had missed the relief bus, as most states have already formed the lists of SCs and STs. The denotified tribes, the DNTs, remained in most cases out of the safety net of social justice. So far, no systematic enumeration of all denotified cities has ever been carried out. But statistical projections on the basis of 1871 and then 1931 population census indicate that a close to accurate guess should place the present population at 14 crores. These people normally try to live without making them noticed in any conspicuous way. The stigma has not ceased to chase them. Over the last 25 years, ever since I started working with the DNTs of India, I have noticed that the single column short notice news items in district level newspapers in regional languages about a person maimed to death, mob lynch, or picked up by police and found dead in police custody often leads the trail on close scrutiny to a DNT, sacrifice on the altar of our total imperviousness and ignorance about their existence. An 8-year-old Bakarwal girl raped and murdered somewhere in the foothills of the Himalayas. A Pardi woman forced to undress herself in full view of a crowd and asked to drink someone's urine in Maharashtra. A 70-year-old Bajania beaten to pulp on a mere suspicion of stealing a green gourd, to name just a few of the incidents, failed to rouse India's conscience the way A Floyd George's breathlessness moved the entire world into protest and repentance. In order to see the deity story is a unique historical saga in human history, I would like to present the following random overview of some known migrations in ancient times, medieval times, and times closer to ours. The prehistoric Homo sapiens source to all continents, braving unimaginable odds and created the possibility of humans becoming the avant-garde for the process of taking the evolution of life further. Had they not risked their lives and moved out, we would not have been who, where, and what we are today. The original migration and all subsequent migrations traced over thousands of years have been at the heart of the human advent. It was but natural that at the dawn of history known to us, the memories of those long migrations and what humans had learned out of them formed their universe of knowledge. Whether it is the Ramayana for India or the Odyssey for the Greece, epics normally mark the inauguration of great civilizations. And as their generic hallmark, epics present heroic stories of great migrations. Throughout the known history, migrations have spurred, aided, and advanced ideas, knowledge stock, culture, and the horizons of human thought. During the relatively recent history of the last 500 years, it was the phenomenon of migration that brought people and nations to the threshold of modernity. In post-industrial societies, later, outward migration has been a significant factor contributing to economic transitions as well as political trends. The colonial era resulted in an unprecedented transformation in the very nature of self-perception of traditional communities in several continents and the way they aspire to organize themselves as political entities. Large-scale migrations from Europe to Australia, North America contributed to those historical developments almost as a nemesis of the colonial history throughout the 20th century. The migrations from Africa, Asia, and East Europe to the Western world attained an unprecedented scale. The United Nations compiles a report on migration every 2 years, as all of us know. The last report that I have seen was put out in 2017, 4 years back. It records that approximately 258 million persons lived at that time outside the country. Nearly 3/4 of all international migrants were of working age. The high-income countries hosted 64%, nearly 165 million of the total number of international migrants worldwide. It should interest us to know that Indians were and still are at the top of international migration chart. There are 16 million Indians living outside India, described as diaspora. Next in number come the Mexicans with 12 million, other countries with large diasporas, Russian Federation, Bangladesh, and Pakistan and Ukraine. Taken together, probably more than half of Indian population is migratory today. Historically, migration has quickened the human advent and contributed to the global cultural diversity. However, since implicit in it is a challenge to the idea of nation, the nation state does not take to this migration kindly. In United States, the Donald Trump administration attempted to create a regulation to allow the authorities to indefinitely detain migrant families who illegally cross the border. The regulation replaced an older court agreement known as the Flores Settlement that had provisions for limiting the duration for which migrant children could be detained. The Trump administration had been averse to the idea of continuing that provision. The new regulation sent out a chilling message to the families attempting to migrate and the rest of the world. Migratory communities often look like floating mobs to those who are fortunate enough to settle, the sedentary ones, which the migrating communities certainly are not. Migrations have aided what we call the human advent in no small measure, as I said earlier. The word mob appeared on the horizon of the English language towards the end of the 17th century. Initially, it worked as a synonym for so many and such diverse words that in comparison, post-truth of our time should appear an epitome of semantic lucidity. Following the French Revolution and throughout the 19th century, mob provided articulation for the ultimate in social contempt. It took about half a century before the human side of the undifferentiated crowd started receiving attention. This happened when mobilization, in the positive sense, as the first step towards revolutionary changes, found its place in political discourse. However, the compassionate view of mob fully emerged only when the mobile, in its earliest meaning, not the mobile phone, in its earliest meaning as the mechanical, came in circulation as its complementary. If mobs were human, then mobile, though moving, was all mechanical. Even when the mobile was not entirely intended to be a machine-driven car, but a work of kinetic art, it was the mechanical side that was being highlighted. Mobs and mobiles were indeed at odds throughout the 20th century, and they both remained at the heart of the modern history, which is either about revolutions in which mobs played great roles or about the Industrial Revolution in which the mobile steam was crucial. Mobility, human or machine-driven, has indeed been at the heart of modernity. Mobs of the 20th century were sneeringly seen as people, however, normally low on social or cultural memory. They were not rich, not upper caste, nor aristocrats. It would not be inappropriate, therefore, to argue that the seeds of this war on migration were sown in the colonial capitalism. In India, the colonial rule brought in ideas of citizenship which affected the lives of traditionally migratory communities and resulted in their stigmatization. The colonial idea of education and urban settlements as the driving engine of productivity too influenced the land-dependent agrarian communities and generated a relentless migration to urban spaces. Thus, during the process of colonialism, three distinct varieties of migration emerged as inherent social features of the life of modern nation. During the post-colonial times, these varieties have acquired a much greater complexity as several historically not known patterns of migration started emerging. These include forced displacement of peripheral communities affected by development projects, migration resulting out of heavy resource exploitation activities such as mining, and migrations resulting from endangerment of traditional livelihood practices such as agriculture and sea farming. There's also migration related to rising economic aspirations and related to education needs, and finally migration induced by the desire to escape the caste oppression. In other words, migration has been at once a factor contributing to economic and educational betterment as well as an indicator for deprivation and marginalization of those communities. This has also been the situation in other countries. I will now come to what happened to migration in recent times, last few years, from the perspective of international borders, Rohingyas, and also from the perspective of pseudo-nationalism. It was the Central Legislative Assembly of British India which first enacted the Foreigners Act in 1946, in giving the central government the powers to deal with foreigners in India. The enigmatic definition of the term foreigner in it was one who is not Indian. In December 55, the Parliament enacted the Citizenship Act within the framework of Article 11 of the Constitution, which empowered the Parliament to make provisions related to acquisition and termination of citizenship. The 55 Act provided substantive and procedural norms for determination of Indian citizenship. In 2003, 50 years later, the central government promulgated the citizenship rules. Rule 3 and 4 of the Citizenship Rule 2003 provided further outline for the maintenance and preparation of National Register of Citizens throughout the country. This is the historical context, background. In 2015, building upon these provisions and rules, the Ministry of Home Affairs made an amendment in the Passport Entry into India Part Rules 1950 and Foreigners Order 1948, and allowed entry to persons belonging to minority communities in Bangladesh and Pakistan, namely Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians seeking shelter in India due to religious persecution or its apprehension, and had entered into India on or before the 31st December 2014 without valid documents. In July 16, the ministry made an amendment to the Passport Act again and substituted the word Bangladesh for words Afghanistan and Bangladesh, and published in Gazette. This became the rule. The Citizenship Amendment Act bill had been passed through the Lok Sabha in 2019, December, close to the International Human Rights Day, which is 10 December. This happened on 9 December in Lok Sabha, 11 December in the Rajya Sabha. Now, in the backdrop of the CAA was the entire process of compilation of the Assam Citizens Register as part of the National Register of Citizens, as well as the official process initiated for creating a national population register. Within weeks of the Modi II government's coming to power, the Office of the Registrar General of Citizens and Regulations issued notification under Rule 3/4 of Citizenship Rules of 2003 and started preparations towards the Citizenship Register, Population Register, and so on. The entire case, after the act was made, went to the Supreme Court. Almost 135 petitions were filed. A very, very massive agitation emerged in India in response to the CAA. The response to CAA from media, jurists, citizenship groups, citizens groups, and activists included the grounds mentioned by the opposition during the debate in the parliament, and also added more points to it. A bold summary of the issues and arguments raised in opposition to the Citizenship Amendment Act would be that the amendment was violative of the principles and basic values of the Constitution, since it proposed to curb together religion and the citizenship. Club together religion and citizenship. The criteria on which it proposed to offer citizenship were not based on any reasonable classification. It was said It had no reason for including Afghanistan in the list of countries covered by the Act, and no reason for leaving out other neighboring countries such as Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. It was also seen as not being properly comprehensive since it did not take into account other minorities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Other minorities such as the nature worshipping tribal communities in Bangladesh, who too had discrimination to face in Bangladesh, and several of them actually had migrated or have been migrating to India. It makes no reference to other minorities or ethnic groups such as Meitei, Tripura, Marma, Tanchangya, Barua, Khasi, Santhal, Chakma, Biharis, Orans, Mundas, Triparas, Tanchangya, Mros, etc., etc. The cutoff date stipulated by the Act also had no logical basis, and more of such arguments kept coming, resulting into a very massive agitation against the Citizenship Amendment Act. It was argued that the CA would lead to a serious deterioration of India's relation with Bangladesh and may result in placing the lives of the non-Muslim communities covered by the Act in the neighboring countries. The objectives of the Act were found discriminatory, unlawful, and unjust. The classification created in the Act was found to bear no relationship whatever with the stated objective of the Act. That the opposition came from the political parties and from a section of media, organized civil society groups and juries was not so surprising. What surprised everyone within the establishment and outside it was that students on many campuses, young persons, Muslim women who had rarely hit protest podiums, and citizens who otherwise stay off political debates started assembling in various cities and towns to express their concerns over the CAA and the two registers proposed by the government. I have tried to bring in the DNTs, patterns of migration, and the CAA together because I think at the heart of all those three is the vexed question of what is citizenship? Who is a citizen? What is the obligation of the nation to the citizen, not just the obligation of the citizen to the nation? And in our times, in our context, this story is not confined to India alone. We found just a few years back in media images an extremely disturbing image of a young, very, very tender-aged child dead while crossing the seas to France. I think this was a Syrian child. That the dead body of the innocent child, whose fault it at all was not that that child's parents were forced to migrate. That image actually semiotically forms the center of the experiential world of the migrants, aspirational or involuntary migrants in today's times. And some of the migrants are driven not just by economic reasons, or just because they're participating in the long evolutionary act of human advent, but because their state, their nation state has chosen contempt, hatred as its own invited responsibility. The ancient Greek language used holos to mean entire and kostos to indicate a burnt object, a charred object. An entirely charred object, by bringing kostos and holos together, would be Holocaust. The compound word formed out of the two was the Holocauston. Almost a millennium later, the Old French brought it in use as Holocauste. Not much in use, except in the ancient liturgical practices. The term was put in political discourse by Winston Churchill for describing the killing of people in Armenia during the World War I. The world understands it now as the elimination of nearly 1.7 million European Jews and Gypsies during Adolf Hitler's regime in Germany. The idea was floated in its initial phase as the final solution. The Hebrew word so or shoah, S-H-O-A-H, which means in that language a great calamity, and is pronounced as shah or shah, is preferred by many, by those who have gone through the experience and those who want to carefully avoid the theological connotation of Holocaust involving an idea of offering of sacrifice. The Shah or the Shah was decidedly a shame for humanity and will be remembered for centuries as an inhuman act. A question that has been bothering millions of Indians, like millions outside India, is India sliding towards some kind of Shah? Is India destined to give up, alas, its cherished idea of inclusion of all communities and all the religions? Is India sliding position which makes religious minorities and people who believe in various faiths without entitlement to equal judicial relief and equal security of life and property? The very idea is so unnerving that my tongue refuses to utter the words. Yet, the turn of events compels one to ask it. In the 150th year of the formulation of the Criminal Tribes Act of India, the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we doing anything different, anything better than Lord Mayo's colonial government did to the migratory communities of his times? Are we any, if at all, slightly more civilized? Or probably we're doing to what the colonial British government did to our people. These are disturbing questions, large questions, questions which will leave us without answers. But if we did not ask these questions in our time, that we were social scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. Most captivating. Now, Professor Dubey, for the chair's remarks.
Well, I was very much inspired and motivated by listening to the lecture of Professor Devi. And it has left a deep impression in me about his devotion and dedication to the cause of those who suffer on account of artificial walls being raised against migration on a variety of grounds, most of which are outdated, contrary to modern thinking, and contrary to modern norms that should determine human relations and relations among nations. I think generally a memorial lecture is a finality. There is nothing to say much and beyond that. But I would justify my presence here by saying just a few words. After listening to Professor Devi, one might be wondering whether he was, not moving from one subject to the other without it being clear as to how they are linked. I mean, from the denotified tribes in India to migration in the earlier time to the migration today, to our Citizenship Act. And but I would like to say that there is indeed a link. And the most important link is that all the narratives that he has given us involve cruel, atrocious, and in some cases, massive violation of human rights. That is the link. Right from the beginning of his speech till he has ended. And another thing is that, of course, they are all related to migration in one form or the other. As he has very rightly pointed out, migration has played a very important role in human history. It has added to the stock of knowledge, to enriched human culture, brought the beauty of diversity to different lands in the world. And in recent times, it has been a major factor for mobility of labor, people moving from one place to other. Fueled, in a sense, free market led growth in the world. Actually, he has referred to the word mobile in his speech. And I heard the word mobile for the first time as a student of economics. And it was about the mobility of factors of production. And the mobility of factors of production was regarded as a precondition for equilibrium in a competitive society. That you would not have the right prices fixed, right values determined, unless you have the mobility of factor. It was a basic assumption, an unrealistic assumption at that time, because there is never a perfect mobility. And the assumption was that it should be a perfect mobility. There is no doubt that globalization in its current phase, starting from the mid-1980s, has been a major factor expanding, widening migration. And that is in spite of the fact that in some of the regimes that were established in the early 1990s, and I'm here referring to the WTO regime, in the agreement which relates to migration, that is GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services, movement of people for the purpose of migration and citizenship and unemployment was explicitly excluded from the scope of that agreement. In spite of that limitation set by nations, many of which were still living in the past, including the major developed countries who insisted on this clause, migration took place on a very large scale during the time of the 80s and the 90s. And this has been brought out very by concrete examples, but facts and figures, in a book by Saskia Sassen, at that time in the Columbia University, where she has said that in spite of all the regulations, globalization, migration has taken place on a large scale. But migration of a different kind than that used to take place earlier. It was a migration to meet the fancy and individualized requirements of the high income groups which have become more prominent in society. That is kind of in the nature of providing personal services and very, very specialized goods, very individualized goods, not the standard goods of the market. This is the main thesis of that book. And like Stiglitz' book, there is also called globalization and its whatever is the title, I'm not remembering. I think the recent times there has been a kind of a reaction against migration, and that is because of the same reason why there has been a reaction against globalization itself. That is the kind of anomalies that it has created in the society. And I think that the migration, that is also because it is implicit in the process of globalization based on free play of market forces for this kind of discontent to arise. And it did arise. And as a letter of consequence of which there were very kind of severe reaction against migration and in favor of citizenship, in favor of nationalism in the earlier sense of the term, narrow sense of the term. And we saw that in what Mr. Trump did in the United States. We have seen that in this lecture, in what has been done recently in our own country. We have seen it internationally in the sense that when it came to to receiving the refugees from Syria and from other developing countries of the world, the Western countries who were basically the author and the guardian of the concept of non-refoulement. That is, you can't send people back to the place from where they have moved because of misery, risk to life, either posed by state or posed by circumstances. You can't give them back. That was the concept of refugee law, a very hallowed concept. And the developed countries were supposed to follow that. And the developing countries were the deviants, and they were pulled up from time to time. But in the face of migration from West Asia, it was the other way around. They were the developed countries which went back on the concept of non-refoulement. And there was one personality who stood out and accepted migration, risking her political career, and that was Angela Merkel. So we are currently in a situation of crisis so far as free movement of people are concerned, so far as migration is concerned. I think that it is I say that it is an inevitable consequence, a logical evolution of societies in human history, as has been traced by Professor Devi. And my view is that it cannot be stopped. Coming to our own country, I think I share the aspiration expressed in his lecture by Professor Devi that the movement in the country joined in huge numbers by students, women, and other classes which normally used to remain neutral in events of political turmoil and changes, would make a difference in the situation, make difference in the direction of what should be desirable, what is essential for preserving our democratic and secular society. So I will conclude by this. I hope I have not kept you too long with this lecture.
Thank you, sir, very much. Those are very important comments. We'll have a brief discussion, question, answer, comments time. May I request Professor Virginius Khaka to make a short comment, and after that, Professor Devi Prasanna Patnaik, and then it will be open. Professor Khaka, please. Please unmute yourself. Professor Khaka, can you hear me? Professor Khaka, I can... Oh, okay. He doesn't seem to be... Yeah, he's there. Can you unmute? Yes. Professor Khaka, please unmute yourself.
अरे की करूँ देखो नहीं तो
बंद कर.
बोल लो
Yes, Aparajita. Professor Khaka, yeah, I have unmuted, but it's not unmuting. Yeah. Khaka, please unmute. Ask to. Khaka, can you unmute?
Yeah, now it's okay. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, please.
I was not able to unmute.
Okay, now.
There are problems.
Okay.
Well, I know Professor Devi for quite a long period of time, and this was a fascinating lecture. Someone from other than social sciences who has been engaged in the issue of the Adivasis and particularly so-called the criminal tribes or DNT. He has been at the forefront of addressing these issues, not only academically, but also in terms of addressing the questions of justice. So that's it. And I thought that it was very pertinent to begin that whole idea of crime and the migrations, because DNTs were criminalized precisely because they were constantly on move. They were nomadic people, and therefore their very migration, to some extent, impelled the colonial state to criminalize them. So I think it's a very, and therefore I think looking at that particular aspects of the movement, the migrations, and the criminality, and trying to look at the other kinds of migrations, particularly, for example, the people who have migrated but who are now not really being considered as citizens, as it was the case with the DNTs in the 1870s. I think looking at the migrations and the migrant, particularly from the lens of the crimes or the lens of the DNTs, is a very interesting thing, and I think that's quite fascinating. But it has always been the fact that whereas on the one hand the colonial state tries to criminalize because they are the move, but on the other hand you find it precisely around that same time, or even a little earlier, the colonial state also trying to push people outside of their habitat. So if you really look at the migrations that were overseas migrations almost from the early 19th centuries, and you find even in Assam, where you find that sea of people were really being pushed by various mechanisms, and therefore trying to push them into move into the Assam as a coolie, as indentured labor, and so on and so forth. So it all depends as to how the colonial state was really looking at. On the one hand, migration is a problematic. On the other hand, the very settlement becomes a problematic, and you really try to push the people out there. I think that's there, and I think it's always been a problem also in the sense as to why even in post-independent India, the DNTs or issue of the DNTs was not really adequately addressed, even in the Constituent Assembly. Although we had, let's say, debates on tribes, debates on caste, but somewhere else you find that the debates on DNTs, if I'm not really mistaken, is really escaped. And they were the most brutalized and dehumanized populations. And I think somewhere as our national leadership, in fact, could not really address that kind of issues. And even today, I think as a country, as a nation, as a people, I think we have still failed, and I think they are still into that process of humiliation, stigmatizations, and the criminality as to how the state are really trying to address them. So wherever there is a crime, invariably you find that people from this kind of categories of people will really be identified. So these are issues are there, and I think migration is much more complex. It is always good to find out as to which sort of people who migrate, who are criminalized, which sort of people who migrate, who actually are escape this kind, or they're given opportunities and they're seen as mobile, as a good. So you find even in migrations, you find there are migrations which are negative, migrations which are positive. And I think much of the way in which this has to be categorized is the kind of response of the state. So state is very crucial in terms of the way it classifies people. And I think the classification of certain set of migrants is always a negative, and classifications of certain sets of the migrants is always seen in a positive sense. So I think the role of the state, and somewhere else I think the civil society need to really look at as to how we address this issue of the way in which state actually tries to categorize the people in terms of, let's say, as a criminal, as a stigmatized, as dehumanized, and so on and so forth. So this is the comment that I just wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Devi Prasanna Patnaik, please unmute yourself. I have asked. Please unmute yourself. Professor Patnaik, please unmute yourself. Professor Patnaik, can you hear me? Please unmute. Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah, please unmute. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Professor Patnaik, great to see you. Good evening.
You have again muted yourself, Professor Patnaik. You had unmuted. Please unmute again, Professor Patnaik. Yes, now you can speak. Oh, yeah.
I have had the opportunity of working with Dr. Devi for quite a long time. And I know him as one interested in human issues in general. He has worked on tribals, he has worked on general public, he has worked on the state, laws, everything. But I would like to point out one or two things only. One thing is that the state, formation of the state, we should look at very carefully. Because as the state was formed, people came in, and the state sometimes invited people to come and help them in their development process. So the migrant labor became one of the fundamental issues. And once they found that they do not need them, they either killed them or they, for example, the Turks in Germany or elsewhere, even in Myanmar, wherever there are things that are happening now. So our categorization of people and making them either saying that they are criminals, and now we are saying, now in our country, we have also started saying that some people are Deshodrohi, that they do not agree with us, so they are Deshodrohi, they are anti-nationals. So this is one of the areas which needs careful investigation. The second thing I would like to point out is the issue of language. That this migrant labor, migrant population and the language issue becomes a critical point in the togetherness or distancing of people. Because language is one of the fundamental things that brings together people or distances them. I think that is another area which Dr. Devi would look into it a little more carefully. The last thing I would like to point out is that, you see, diversity is a phenomenon of the whole world. But the diversity was divided into two platforms. One is the USA-led Western civilization, the other is the rest, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the rest. But the diversity was there. And the diversity was handled differently in different places. If you look at the two logico-philosophical positions of both the groups. The Western is either or, and this side is both and. Then we will find out that how this thing has developed over time. Many civilizations have developed all over the world, but they have, like water bubbles, they have grown and they have burst. But Indian civilization is the only one which has continued for 7,000 years with unbroken history. Why is it that it has happened like that? That is because this both and principle. 5,000 years before the colonialists came and told us about globalization and localization, we had already said that we will treat the whole world as one extended family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we had said. So therefore, this is another dimension which we have to see how these two different platforms have developed and how they have treated people moving from one part to the other as migrants, use them for their benefits, and whenever they find that they are no longer useful, they either kill them or throw them out of their country. So this is the another dimension which we have to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. Before I invite Professor Devi to respond, are there other questions or comments, please? Anybody else?
It's a great compliment to me.
Professor Devi, hold on, Professor Devi. I know. All right. There are no further questions. In the chat box, are there comments? Anantagiri, please. So, asked to unmute. Can you unmute? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Devi, whom I call as Ganesh Bhai, and thank you, Professor Mohanty, respected friends. Now, in this deeply moving and rendering, soul-wrenching account, the question at the same time is that this whole state production of life, like communities, suddenly categorizing them into criminal tribes, but people themselves, were they helpless, or what was the dynamics of agency and subjectivity? Let us compare to the American situation and the slave conditions. We know how deep work has been on slave revolt, not only slave revolt, but also slave creativity, the creativity of language. So my query is, in your study, have you found the dynamics of agency, both interrogation and transformation of this production of categories and production of destruction of life? The similar question also, my one half line is, the similar question also vis-a-vis the migrant population. Now, even in the most difficult circumstances, what is the dynamics of creativity and what kind of creative songs, literature have emerged from both these domains, which really interrogate the state destruction of life and livelihood.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other question or comment? No? Okay. Okay, Professor Devi, you may please respond.
The comment by Professor Khaka, the most outstanding scholar and authority on the Adivasis and DNTs in this country. And comment by Dr. D.P. Patnaik, who for the field of linguistics is the ultimate, not just in India, but a lot outside India as well. I think that these comments came, I think is a compliment to me. And they are being kind in making these comments. So I just want to thank them. I want to say, even if it is even if it is not appropriate for this discourse, that I feel extremely delighted, happy, and thrilled to see Professor D.P. Patnaik in good health. And I wish a very long life for him, much longer life. Professor Dr. Giri's comment is, I noted it. Thank you. There is, of course, joy song. I mean, there are songs, prisoner songs, worker songs, and human beings seek joy wherever they are, celebrate their status. That does not, however, diminish, even in the smallest measure, the agony, the injustice. I have seen images of martyrs going, to gallows with a smile, but the injustice is more blatantly present there than the joy of the victim. I think we must act. Quite frankly, I think we must all of us must act. And if we did not, I'm not saying that all of us are not acting. We are in the best possible way. But really, the times we come into times when, if we default on this duty to humanity, we may not be judged well by the future sociologists and historians. Thank you. I want to thank you for suffering me for such a long time, and I want to thank you for giving me this space to articulate my concerns. It is the Citizenship Act and neglect of the DNTs and harshness to the migratory laborers who at the beginning of Corona, we have seen a 7-year-old girl walking 230 kilometers and dying on the way. We've seen that. But a lot more is happening to all of us in this country. And probably if we did not act now, I won't be able to forgive myself. With that confession, without any implied criticism towards anybody, I respect everybody present here, but I cannot hold myself back from saying this. With this, I salute the center. I express my admiration for all distinguished scholars. I thank the hosts and SAGE in particular. And I seek your permission to take rest. Just risen out of a cardiac episode. And I think if I speak no more, that will be good for my heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Devi. We are most grateful to you. Now, may I request Dr. Nityananda, the director of CSD, to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. It's my great pleasure proposing the vote of thanks for all who had made this event possible. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Devi for giving that wonderful lecture and, of course, agreeing to delivering this lecture. We'd like to thank all our partners for this event: Anthropological Survey of India, India International Center, and SAGE, especially Mr. Vivek Mehra, who have been partnering not in this, but for the last 2 occasions also they partner with us. Professor Binay Srivastava, who is not with us now, played a very important role in developing this partnership between Anthropological Survey of India and CSD. We are fortunate to have his wife, Professor Kumkum Srivastava, in this event. And of course, the 3 books that we released, Professor Srivastava was the first editor of that volume, apart from Professor Mohanty being the series editor. Also, thank Professor Prasam Trivedi and Professor Tilak for editing the other 2 volumes that were released. And of course, last but not the least, our own people who played important role in today's lecture. Professor Dubey, who presided over this event and made very interesting and wonderful remarks after the speech. Professor Mohanty, of course, he is the architect of today's show, and of course the other people who were involved with this. Manika Chopra is the managing editor. Aparajita, who is our book review editor.
Yeah.
And of course, Sheila, who is the administrative officer, also played important role in organizing this. And I would like to thank you all of you for participating in it, and I would like to also apologize at the end for some inconvenience where some bad elements tried to create some problem in days of internet and connectivity. It's often difficult. People can take over things from you easily. So I would like to thank everybody, and if I have mentioned, if I have failed in mentioning somebody's name, I'm also apologizing for that. Thank you all. Thank you.
Aparajita has to make the last announcement, but it seems she's not been able to unmute herself. Are you unmuted now, Aparajita?
You have to unmute her and say
Yeah. I'm sorry. I did. Yes. Yes, Aparajita now. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So before we close, whoever is interested in getting the soft copy of the lecture may please write to socialchange@csdindia.org, and kindly also request you to add the organization and name of your current affiliation. And before we close, thanks, last but not the least, kindly accept our deep apologies for the disruption. Nevertheless, it couldn't prevent the very important discourse from taking place. Thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Devi. Thank you. Dr. Vibha Joshi, I saw your message. I'm glad we can do whatever we can for the volumes in honor of Binay Srivastava, and do write to me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Patnaik and Professor Khaka, Professor Giri, for those very interesting comments. Thank you. Thank you. I'm now ending the meeting. Thank you, sir, Professor Dubey. It was a wonderful occasion. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. And we had 3 generations of scholars and activists in this meeting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Dev,